If you thought Lent and the Paschal Triduum were basically the same thing, don't worry, you're not alone. But careful, because that confusion makes a lot of Catholics live the most important days of the year without really understanding what the Church is celebrating. And we're not talking about a technical detail or an expert obsession or a debate for liturgists. We're talking about something much more serious, understanding where preparation ends and where the very center of the Christian faith begins. Because one thing is to walk toward the cross, and something very different is to step fully into the mystery of the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ. So let's get straight to it. The basic difference is this. Lent is a time of preparation. The Paschal Triduum is the central celebration of what Christ did for us. One disposes you, the other plunges you into the event itself. And here's the important part. If you stop at that one sentence, you already understand more than a lot of people. But the best part is still coming, because the problem isn't just mixing up names. The problem is that when you blend Lent and the Triduum, as if they were the same thing, you end up living Holy Week as one blurry block, without distinguishing what's happening at each moment. Look, a lot of people use Lent, Holy Week, and the Paschal Triduum almost like synonyms. Everything gets thrown into the same bag. Everything sounds more or less religious, more or less solemn, more or less intense, and that's it. But no, the Church doesn't organize these days randomly. It doesn't set dates just because. It doesn't lengthen ceremonies because it enjoys complicating the calendar. There's a very deep logic behind all of it, and when you understand it, it completely changes how you live these weeks. Let's start with Lent. Lent is not yet the great celebration of the Paschal mystery. Lent is the road toward that mystery. It's a time of preparation, conversion, inner cleansing, putting the heart back in its place. That's why fasting appears. That's why more intense prayer appears. That's why almsgiving appears. That's why there's a more sober, more penitential tone. During Lent, the Church isn't simply telling you, behave better for 40 days. That's not the point. It's telling you something much stronger. Get ready, because you're approaching the center of your faith. Wake up, reorder your life, turn down the noise, face your sin, return to God for real, not just in words. That's the tone of Lent. It's not the summit yet, it's the climb. It's not the goal yet, it's the road to the goal. And here's the key. The Church knows nobody truly enters Easter if they're distracted, lukewarm, anesthetized, or running on autopilot. That's why Lent exists. Because the human heart needs preparation, it needs pruning, it needs silence, it needs to revisit things it normally avoids. Now, this is where many people stumble. Because Lent is intense, because it involves fasting, because it leads into Holy Week, because everything starts to feel more serious, many people think they're already fully inside the main thing. And not exactly. Because preparing something is not the same as celebrating it. You can prepare for a wedding for months. You can organize everything, choose the clothes, rehearse, make calls, handle details. But preparing the wedding is not the wedding. You can train for a race, change habits, discipline yourself, push harder. But training is not crossing the finish line. Something similar happens with Lent. It prepares you, it orients you, it corrects you, it empties you of certain things. But it is not yet the heart of the Paschal celebration. And then we reach the Paschal Triduum, and this is where everything changes completely. The Paschal Triduum is not a nice appendix tacked onto the end of Lent. It's not some solemn add-on to close out the season. It's not just the most exciting part. It's the center of the liturgical year, the highest moment, the absolute summit. When the Church enters the Triduum, it is no longer simply preparing the Christian. It is celebrating the central mystery of the faith, that Christ freely gives himself, dies, is buried, and rises again. That is the Triduum. And if you want to say it even more clearly, Lent leads you to the Triduum, but the Triduum is no longer a path. The Triduum is the event. That's why the tone changes. That's why everything concentrates. That's why the Church doesn't treat these days as just more religious days, but as the core of Christianity. If you take this away, you don't get a smaller version of the faith. You don't get an incomplete faith. You get nothing. Because here we're not celebrating an idea. We are entering liturgically into what Christ did for us. And here's a question many people have never seriously asked. What exactly does Triduum mean? Literally, it means 3 days. But careful, this isn't just counting 3 calendar days like Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, and that's it. It's one single great celebration unfolded across these holy days, where the Church accompanies sacramentally and liturgically the passion, death, and resurrection of the Lord. It begins with the evening Mass of the Lord's Supper on Holy Thursday. It continues with Good Friday, when the passion and death of Christ are contemplated. It passes through the tremendous silence of Holy Saturday, and it reaches its climax in the Easter Vigil, which is not just another Mass, but the most important night of the entire year. And that changes a lot. Because if you thought the Triduum was simply a few days within Lent, now you see it isn't. Here you are no longer in the penitential preparation as such. Here you are in the very heart of the Paschal mystery. Let's go step by step, because each of these days carries enormous weight. Holy Thursday. Many people reduce it to a meal, the washing of feet, a particularly emotional Mass. Yes, all of that is there. But what the Church is contemplating at that moment is far greater. Christ freely gives himself, institutes the Eucharist, gives his Church the ministerial priesthood, and voluntarily enters into his passion. It's not simply the Last Supper as a touching episode. It is the immediate threshold of the redemptive sacrifice. Christ is not improvising. He is not being dragged into something that got out of hand. He gives himself. He sacramentally anticipates his offering. He gives his body and his blood. And there's an intensity here many people miss. Holy Thursday is not only remembrance, it is a real entry into that mystery. Then comes Good Friday, and here there is no Mass. That alone should make you pause for a second. The tone changes in a radical way. The Church contemplates the Lord's passion, adores the cross, and enters into that sacred sorrow where Christ dies for the salvation of the world. But careful, there's a very common mistake here too. Many people live Good Friday only through sadness, only through mourning, only through the emotion of how terrible it all was. And yes, there is pain. Of course there is. But if you stay only there, you miss half of it. Because Good Friday is not just the memory of a horrifying injustice. It is the celebration of Christ's sacrifice. It is the day love goes to the very end. It is the day the sin of the world is laid upon the Lamb. It is the day the cross stops being only an instrument of torture and is revealed as the place where salvation is opened. And then comes Holy Saturday, which often passes almost unnoticed for many people, and yet it has tremendous force, because it is the day of silence. Christ has died. The body has been buried. The Church waits. It doesn't rush. It doesn't fill the void. It doesn't hurry grief so it can get quickly to joy. And that teaches something powerful too. Between the cross and the resurrection, there is real silence. Not everything gets resolved immediately. Not everything shines right away. Not everything gives comfort instantly. Holy Saturday forces the Church to remain, to wait, to keep vigil. And then comes the Easter Vigil. And here, yes, everything bursts open, but not like a superficial party, not like a mood change, not like finally the sad part is over. No. Here the Church celebrates that Christ has conquered death. Here the resurrection is proclaimed. Here the night is pierced by light. Here everything that came before finds its meaning. That's why the Easter Vigil is the summit. Not because it's long, not because it has more symbols, not because it's prettier, but because in it the Church celebrates the core of everything. Christ is risen. And if Christ does not rise, the Christian faith collapses. That's how radical it is. That's why the Triduum is not spiritual decoration in the calendar. It is the living center of the liturgical year. Now, here's the most common mistake in this whole topic, and it's worth saying clearly. The mistake is thinking Lent, the Triduum, and Holy Week form some kind of uniform Mass where everything is more or less the same, just with a different color each day. No. One thing is the time of preparation. Another thing is the celebration of the central mysteries. And a third thing is the popular way many people refer to the whole set of days as Holy Week. When that gets mixed together without nuance, two things happen. First, clarity is lost. Second, intensity is lost. Because if everything is the same, nothing truly stands out. If everything belongs to the same undifferentiated block, you no longer see that the Church leads the believer from Lenten conversion to the eruption of the Paschal mystery. And that flattens the experience. It makes liturgy become habit. It makes the holy days feel like cultural tradition. It makes people say, we're in Lent, even when, liturgically, something greater and more specific has already begun. And look, this isn't terminological obsession. It's not about correcting someone for sport. It's not about showing off precision. It's about understanding what's actually happening. I'll put it as simply as possible. Lent is the road. The Triduum is the summit. Lent disposes the heart. The Triduum celebrates the mystery. Lent prepares you to face what Christ has done. The Triduum brings you into that self-gift, that death, and that victory. If you remember that, you already have a very clear compass. But careful, we still have to answer the question that causes the most confusion. When does Lent actually end? And here, many people hesitate. Some think it ends on Palm Sunday. Others think it lasts until Holy Saturday. Others lump all of Holy Week into Lent without distinguishing anything. And that's where the tangle begins. The clearest way to say it is this. Lent lasts up until before the Mass of the Lord's Supper on Holy Thursday. In other words, the Paschal Triduum begins with that evening celebration on Holy Thursday. From that point, you're no longer simply in Lent. You enter something else, the Triduum. And many people misunderstand this because, in everyday language, we keep saying, we're still in Lent throughout Holy Week. But liturgically, the key is here. The Triduum is not simply the final part of Lent as if nothing changes. With the Mass of the Lord's Supper, the Paschal Triduum begins. And that explains why the tone, the rites, and the spiritual density of those days carry such a different weight. Do you see it? Suddenly everything fits better. You're no longer placing dates out of mere curiosity. You're understanding the Church's inner logic. You're seeing how she doesn't only remember events of the past, but leads you pedagogically to the center of faith. First, she calls you to conversion. Then she brings you fully into the Paschal mystery. First, she prepares you. Then she introduces you. And here comes the most practical part of all this. What changes in your life if you understand this difference well? For starters, it changes how you live Lent, because you stop seeing it as a season of making sacrifices out of habit. It's no longer a list of small religious renunciations. It becomes serious preparation, a training of the heart, a time to arrive more awake, cleaner, and more available for the holy days. It also changes how you live the Triduum, because you stop seeing it as a series of long, somewhat dense celebrations that simply happen once a year. You begin to see that this is the center, that you're not attending a beautiful rite, you're entering what Christ did for you. And it even changes the way you look at Holy Week as a whole, because you stop living it as atmosphere, as tradition, as inherited custom, or as a vague emotion. You start living it with structure, meaning, and depth. And honestly, that's the difference between passing through these dates and truly entering into them. Because when everything gets blended, the soul stays on the surface. But when you distinguish the times well, the liturgy stops being confusing and starts revealing an astonishing pedagogy. The Church doesn't throw you straight into the heart of the mystery. First, she prepares you in Lent. Then she brings you into the Triduum. And finally, she makes you celebrate Christ's victory at Easter. One thing is climbing the mountain. Another thing is reaching the summit. And if you take only one idea from this entire video, let it be this. Lent is not the center. It leads you to the center. And the Paschal Triduum is not an added finale. It is the very heart of what the Church celebrates. One prepares. The other celebrates. One disposes you. The other brings you fully into the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ. And when you understand that, you won't live these days the same way again. Leave me a comment if you also had this confusion, and subscribe to keep understanding the faith without tangles or detours.